Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk about something that farmers hate, and that is grain shrinkage.
Whenever you think of shrink, I guess that means smaller, right? And what happens is you harvest 100 bushels of corn and you think, great, I'm going to go to town and sell 100 bushels of corn. And when the grain elevator pays you for the corn, they pay you for 95 bushels. And you say, wait a second, where did the other 5 bushels go? Well, the elevator says your corn was 17% moisture or 18% moisture, and we only allow 15% moisture in the grain. So we docked you for that moisture. And you say, well, wait a second, how's that work? Well, as they dry the grain down to 15% or less, so it's safe for them to store it in the bins, when they take that moisture out of the grain, here's where the shrink is created. Now, those kernels that were plump and full of moisture, when they dry some of the moisture out, the kernels shrink. Now, instead of 100 bushels, they're left with 95 bushels or whatever the number is.
So in other words, there are fewer total pounds. You're going, as the farmer, trying to sell moisture to the elevator, and they're not going to pay you for moisture. They're going to pay you for actual grain. So that moisture figure they're looking for is 15%, and when that moisture comes out from 18% in Darren's example down to 15, then that's a portion of the shrink. Now you might say, well, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. Why for corn shrink do they usually figure 1.3%? Why for soybean shrink do they figure 1.5%? Well, the reason why is because of the other loss that there is. So there are certain parts of the soybean seed or parts of the corn seed that are just going to start to disappear. They'll flake off, they'll get chipped off, whatever. There is some loss there. So all the elevators, to protect themselves, they're figuring more than just the 1-to-1 ratio of, hey, we took 3 points of moisture out, we should be docking 3%. No, it's not a 3% loss. We're going to figure 3.9% just so we've got some extra there, because we are going to damage that grain a little bit when we're drying it.
Well, when you think about it, who's buying the grain that's coming off of farms? In some cases, it's processors. Maybe they're going to crush the soybeans, for example, and extract the oil. Maybe they're going to take the corn and turn it into corn ethanol. Or maybe they're just going to ship it overseas as grain. There's a lot of different uses for that grain later on down the road. And for farmers, getting it out of the field and being able to sell it is the big thing. I mean, you think about it, farmers had to wait all summer long to get their paycheck in the fall when they start harvesting that grain. And so for farmers, they aren't going to wait for that corn to get down to 15%, for example. They're going to harvest it when it's 18 or 20 or 22%. And, you know, Brian talked about that shrink, and there's lots of things that can happen besides water leaving. You know, little pieces of the corn kernel can get chipped off and that kind of thing. For farmers, if they can actually harvest that grain at 18 to 22% moisture, they do a lot better. They have a lot less loss out in their field. When corn gets too dry, sometimes it can shatter right off the ear, and as that ear hits the combine head, it just explodes, and there's corn kernels flying all over, and some of them ending up on the ground. Or when the corn plant gets too dry, sometimes it can actually drop the ears onto the ground before the combine ever gets out in the field to catch them. So for farmers, they don't want to wait until the grain is dry enough for the elevator to store it. They just want to get it dry enough that they can actually get it harvested and take it in. That's why farmers understand shrink is just part of the business. They're not going to say, well, I can't afford any shrink. I've got to wait till my soybeans are down to 13% and my corn's down to 15%. They have to harvest when they can harvest, and they just know that's part of the game. They're going to lose a little money on shrink.
Well, the flip side, though, is with soybeans, what can happen very easily out in the field is soybeans can naturally dry down to even 8%. Well, if soybeans can get sold to the grain elevator at 13%, that's 5 points of moisture that farmer's lost. And we figure 1.5% shrink, so in effect, that's 7.5% of the farmer's yield. So farmers are trying to harvest their soybeans as much as they can at 13%, and they're way ahead to take a dock at 14% than they are to sell the grain at 8%. So there's a lot of difference there when we start talking about this moisture. It's a really big deal. Farmers want to try to have the maximum amount of moisture in that grain, and then we all realize there is some shrink that's going to come out if you bring in grain that's a little too wet.
Well, there's a lot of things that grain farmers have to think about in order to have a successful and profitable crop. One of the other things we haven't mentioned yet is weed control. Can you identify this week's weed of the week?